The rain fell softly on the long stone driveway as Clara stepped out of the old car beside her mother, who had worked for the Beaumont family for almost 20 years. The air smelled of wet leaves and old iron, and the mansion before them stood like something pulled from another century. Tall, cold, and too quiet. The kind of house that seemed to breathe with secrets, its windows glowing faintly from the storm outside, the lightning flashing across its stone walls like ghostly fingers. Clara had only seen it once before when she was a child, and even then she remembered feeling like something inside was watching her, waiting for her to grow old enough to understand what it wanted. Her mother told her not to be silly, that houses didn't stare, but as she grew up she stopped believing that. She knew some places held memories too heavy to die, and this house felt like one of them. The Beaumonts were rich, old money rich, the kind of people whose names were written on plaques in museums and whispered about in newspapers when their art was donated to galleries. Their home sat on the edge of town, surrounded by iron fences and marble statues, every inch of it screaming power and pride, and when Clara followed her mother inside, she immediately noticed the smell of oil paint and polish mixing in the air, as if someone had been trying to erase something and cover it with perfume. The walls were covered with paintings, large golden frames filled with landscapes, portraits, and dark scenes from history, and though most looked expensive and old, one painting stood out immediately to Clara. A portrait of a woman in a long blue dress, standing in front of a lake with her hands folded. Her face calm but her eyes strangely alive. It didn't match the style of the others, the colors looked too bright, too fresh, and the way the light hit the canvas almost made it shimmer like it was still wet. Her mother noticed her staring and whispered, "Don't touch anything, Clara. These people don't like fingerprints on their history." But Clara couldn't look away. The woman in the painting seemed almost familiar, her eyes too sharp, her mouth slightly curved like she was hiding something, and when lightning flashed outside the window, Clara could swear the woman's eyes glinted for just a second as if they had reflected real light, not paint. She stepped closer, tilting her head, noticing a faint scent of turpentine near the frame, something painters used when finishing their work. But this portrait was supposed to be centuries old, wasn't it? That's what Mrs. Beaumont had said during her mother's last visit, boasting about how it was the soul of their legacy, painted by a long-dead artist who captured the beauty of her great-grandmother. But Clara had seen enough art at the museum back in town to know when paint was new. Her mother tugged her arm gently and whispered, "Leave it, we just clean here, nothing else," and Clara nodded, though her eyes lingered on the thin streak of gloss running down the woman's sleeve where paint hadn't dried fully, a tiny detail no one else would notice, but to her it looked like the painting was sweating. The housekeeper led them to their small quarters near the kitchen, narrow rooms with old wallpaper and low ceilings, and as Clara unpacked her few clothes, she could hear the faint laughter of the Beaumonts from the grand dining room down the hall. Her mother moved quietly, wiping her hands with a towel, muttering under her breath that this house had become strange since the renovation. The new art dealer came last month, and after that, the mistress had started locking rooms that were once open. Rich people have rich people problems, her mother said, trying to smile. But the way her hands trembled told Clara something else. Maybe fear, maybe memory, she couldn't tell. Later that evening, Clara wandered down the corridor near the main staircase, pretending to look for a broom closet. Though she was really trying to see the painting again. She passed the grand piano, the tall mirrors, the rows of portraits staring down at her like silent witnesses, and when she reached the hall with the woman in blue, she stopped, because something had changed. The light from the chandelier flickered softly across the canvas, and the face seemed sadder now, like the smile had been wiped off by the storm's reflection. She took a slow step closer, and for the first time noticed the initials on the bottom corner, two faint letters, LM, written over what looked like another signature hidden underneath. Her heart began to race. She rubbed her thumb across the surface lightly, feeling the smooth layer of new paint, and she realized the truth. The painting wasn't old at all, it was new, and whoever painted it had tried to cover the name of the real artist. Just then, voices echoed down the hall. She froze, pressing herself against the wall. The sound of high heels and a man's shoes clicking on marble grew closer. Mrs. Beaumont's cold voice drifted through the air. "We cannot let anyone find out, do you understand? Not after what happened in Paris," and a deep male voice replied, "Don't worry, the replacement is perfect. The girl will never notice." Clara held her breath, clutching her skirt, afraid they would hear the pounding of her heart. The man's tone grew tense. "And what about the original? Mrs. Beaumont's voice lowered, sharp as a knife. It's gone, buried with the rest of the story, and if anyone asks, it never existed. When the footsteps faded, Clara stepped out, her knees weak. She stared again at the portrait, her reflection trembling on the varnish, and whispered, "What are you hiding?" The thunder cracked above the roof, shaking the chandelier slightly, and she swore for a second she heard something whisper back, something faint like a sigh trapped inside the paint. She turned and hurried back to her room, her breath shallow, her mind racing with the words she had heard. What story could be so dangerous that they would lie about a painting? Her mother was asleep, exhausted from cleaning the dining hall, but Clara lay awake listening to the rain on the glass, thinking about the initials LM and the phrase buried with the rest of the story. She imagined the woman in the blue dress stepping out of the frame at night, walking through the halls searching for something lost, maybe the truth itself, maybe her name. The sound of a door creaking down the hallway made Clara sit up straight. She grabbed her lamp and whispered, "Hello?" But there was no answer, only the sound of the wind pushing against the window panes. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was awake in that house besides her. The next morning, sunlight tried to warm the cold corridors, but the mansion still felt heavy, like the walls held secrets they refused to release. Clara joined her mother in cleaning the main hall again. Her mother noticed her pale face and asked if she had slept. Clara nodded, though her eyes kept drifting toward the painting. Mrs. Beaumont passed by, dressed in her pearls and soft perfume, smiling politely. But there was a stiffness to her eyes, and when she noticed Clara's gaze, she stopped and said, "Ah, you admire her, don't you? She's family, dear, a reminder of our bloodline." Clara forced a small smile and said yes, but inside, she wondered which part was family, the truth or the lie, because now, up close, she could see something that hadn't been there yesterday, a small crack near the edge of the frame, revealing an older layer of paint beneath, darker, rougher, like something fighting to be seen again. That night, when the storm returned, the power flickered, and Clara walked to the grand hallway again. Her footsteps soft on the marble floor. The painting seemed to glow faintly under the lightning flashes, and she whispered, "You're not who they say you are you?" A drop of water from the leaky ceiling fell onto the frame, sliding down the woman's face like a tear, and for a second Clara felt her skin crawl, because the droplet of water carried a trace of blue paint with it. Like the storm itself was washing away the disguise. Suddenly the silence was broken by a distant door slamming, then muffled voices arguing. She hid behind a column, peeking around to see Mrs. Beaumont and the man in grey again, their shadows long across the floor. "If anyone finds out about the forgery," the man hissed, "we lose everything." Mrs. Beaumont turned toward the painting, her face hard. "Then make sure no one ever looks too closely." Clara ran back to her room, her pulse racing. She told her mother what she heard, but her mother's face went pale. "Clara, you must never repeat that, not even to me. These people can destroy anyone who talks." She held her daughter's hands tightly, trembling. "Promise me you'll stay quiet, finish the week, and we'll leave this place for good." But Clara couldn't promise, not when she knew something dark was hiding in plain sight, something tied to that painting, something her mother was afraid to say out loud, because when she looked into her mother's eyes, she saw the same fear she had seen in the woman in blue, the fear of being silenced. Sleep wouldn't come that night, the thunder echoed, and Clara lay staring at the ceiling, the image of the painting haunting her every blink. She thought about the initials again. LM. Who was that? Why cover it up? And why did Mrs. Beaumont talk about Paris like it was a graveyard for secrets? Somewhere deep inside, Clara knew she wasn't imagining things. The house itself felt alive, shifting slightly when no one watched, sighing through the walls, carrying whispers of the past through its corridors. She could almost hear a woman's voice behind the rain, saying something in French she couldn't understand, soft but desperate. And each time she tried to listen, it faded just as quickly, leaving only silence. Morning came, and with it, a new task. Mrs. Beaumont ordered all the paintings to be dusted and checked for damage from the humidity. Clara and her mother worked side by side, and when they reached the portrait of the woman in blue again, Clara felt a strange pull, as if the woman's eyes were pleading with her. Her mother avoided looking at it, whispering, "Let's move on." But Clara took a cloth and gently wiped the frame, her fingers brushing a corner of the canvas that felt slightly loose. Like something underneath wanted to breathe, she pressed lightly and heard a faint crinkle. like paper hidden between layers. Her pulse quickened. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching, and carefully tugged at the corner, revealing a small folded slip of paper stuck behind the frame. She quickly tucked it into her apron pocket before anyone noticed, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the walls could hear it. Later that evening, while her mother rested, Clara locked herself in the small bathroom with the paper, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was written in faded ink, the language foreign, but she recognized some of it. French, and though she couldn't read it all, one sentence stood out clearly: "The truth of the portrait lies beneath her face." She whispered the words again and again, trying to understand, the same sentence repeated twice at the bottom, written by a shaky hand, as if whoever wrote it was in a hurry, or afraid. She folded it back, hiding it inside her shoe. She would find someone to translate it later. Maybe the old librarian in town who loved art history. But for now, she just knew one thing. The woman in blue wasn't who the Beaumonts said she was, and whatever truth they had buried in that paint was about to come out, no matter how hard they tried to keep it hidden. That night, as the thunder rolled and lightning flickered across the stained glass windows, Clara lay awake once more, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house, and somewhere in the distance, she swore she heard footsteps walking past their door even though everyone was asleep. Slow, measured, almost like a woman walking in heels through a hall of ghosts, and though she tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, she knew deep down that something in this house had finally noticed her, something that didn't want her to stop looking, and as the rain poured harder against the windows, she whispered into the darkness, "I'm not afraid of you," though her voice trembled, because she knew, after tonight, the mansion would never let her leave without showing her what it truly was hiding beneath that paint. The morning sun rose weakly over the mansion, its pale light trying to touch the long stone walls but failing to bring warmth. The air was heavy, almost still, and the smell of turpentine and old dust lingered in every hallway as if the house itself refused to breathe. Clara awoke before her mother, her mind still spinning with the letter she had found the night before, that single line written in French burned in her memory. "The truth of the portrait lies beneath her face." She whispered it softly to herself, the words sounding heavier in the silence. Her mother stirred from the small cot beside her, rubbing her eyes, and asked why she was awake so early. Clara just smiled and said she couldn't sleep, but inside her chest, her curiosity was alive and restless, pulling her toward the painting like a magnet. She had questions she couldn't ignore anymore. Who was the woman in blue, and what truth was buried beneath her painted smile? She followed her mother to the main hall where they were supposed to clean again. The marble floor glistened under the morning light and their footsteps echoed like whispers between the walls. As Clara dusted the furniture, she couldn't stop glancing at the spot where the portrait hung. The woman's eyes seemed sharper now, her gaze almost aware, and the faint crack on the frame had grown longer overnight, as if the painting itself was decaying faster than the rest. Mrs. Beaumont entered the hall with a cup of coffee, her perfume sweet and heavy, her pearls catching the light. "Be gentle with that," she said, pointing at the painting. "It's worth more than the roof above your head." She smiled, but her tone was a warning disguised as charm. Her eyes lingered on Clara for a moment too long before she turned and walked away, leaving behind a trail of silence that felt colder than the air conditioning. Clara's mother sighed, whispering, "She's testing us. Just work quietly and don't stare so much." But Clara couldn't help it. She felt like the portrait was trying to say something, like the woman inside was desperate for someone to listen. Later, when Mrs. Beaumont and her husband left for the city, the house grew strangely still. Even the servants seemed to disappear into corners. Clara took her chance and moved closer to the painting. Her fingers brushed the edge of the frame. She pressed again where she had found the note. Nothing moved this time. But the smell of fresh paint was still there, sharp, real. She leaned close enough to see faint brushstrokes covering another color beneath the blue dress, a darker shade trying to push through, as if the artist had rushed to cover something up. Her mother's voice called from the other room, and Clara stepped back quickly, pretending to clean. But as she turned, something on the floor caught her eye. A small flake of blue paint, curled at the edge like peeling skin. She picked it up carefully and pocketed it. A small piece of proof that she wasn't imagining things. The painting really was fresh, and someone had gone to great lengths to make it look old. That evening, the sky turned gray again, thunder grumbled somewhere beyond the hills, and the air inside the mansion grew damp and cold. Clara carried a tray of tea to the parlor where Mrs. Beaumont's brother sat reading a newspaper. A man she had only seen once before, tall, thin, with hair as white as chalk and eyes as grey as smoke. He looked up when she entered, his gaze sharp and measuring. "You're the maid's daughter," he said flatly, his accent heavy. "I remember you from years ago. You used to play near the rose garden." Clara nodded politely, setting down the tray. "Yes, sir," she said softly. But he continued staring at her as if searching her face for something he'd seen before. "You look like someone," he murmured, almost to himself, then shook his head and turned back to his paper. But Clara could still feel his eyes on her back as she left the room, the weight of his words sticking to her like damp cloth. After dinner, when the mansion settled into its nightly silence, Clara returned to her small room and pulled out the paper she had hidden. She traced the words again, her lips moving silently. The truth of the portrait lies beneath her face. Her mother noticed and frowned. "You're still thinking about that thing?" she asked. "Clara, please, let it go. These people don't like questions." Clara looked up, her voice low but firm. "You know something about it, don't you?" Her mother froze, her eyes darted to the door as if someone might be listening. "No," she whispered. "And even if I did, I'd never tell, not after what happened to Elise." Clara frowned. "Who's Elise?" But her mother just shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "She worked here before you were born. She asked too many questions." She turned away, pretending to fold laundry, and the finality in her tone made Clara's chest tighten with both fear and anger, because silence was the only thing this house seemed to protect. Unable to sleep, Clara waited until midnight, when the grandfather clock in the hall struck 12, its deep echo rolling through the house like a heartbeat. She slipped out quietly, holding a small candle, her bare feet cold against the marble floor. The light flickered as she moved past the mirrors and portraits that lined the walls, their faces half hidden in shadow, watching her with painted eyes. When she reached the main hallway, she stood before the woman in blue once again. The storm outside flashed, lighting the frame for just a second, and she saw it. The faint outline of another face beneath the paint. Her breath caught. She leaned closer, holding the candle near the canvas, and the glow revealed something horrifying. The woman's painted eyes weren't centered. Faint ghostly outlines of another pair of eyes existed underneath, slightly higher, belonging to someone else entirely. She whispered, "Oh my God," her voice trembling, and as if in answer, a small flake of paint drifted down, landing on her wrist. She could now clearly see that another painting lay beneath this one. Maybe an older portrait, maybe the original, hidden under the fresh layer of blue. Suddenly, a sound echoed behind her, a slow, deliberate creak of a door opening. Clara turned sharply, the candle shaking in her hand. Her light revealed the butler standing at the end of the hall, his tall frame casting a long shadow, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "You shouldn't be here at this hour," he said quietly, his voice deep and smooth like old leather. "It's dangerous to wander when the house sleeps." Clara tried to speak, but her throat was dry. "I was just cleaning," she lied, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, his shoes clicking softly against the marble. "No one cleans paintings at midnight," he replied, his lips curving into a faint, almost knowing smile. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Miss Clara. Sometimes it uncovers things better left buried." She backed away, clutching her candle tighter, her heart hammering. "What do you mean?" she whispered, but the butler only turned his head slightly, as if listening to something in the distance, and said, "The lady of the house doesn't like guests poking around her treasures. She values silence above all." And with that, he stepped into the shadows and was gone. Clara ran back to her room, her pulse racing. Her mother was awake now, frightened, asking where she had been. Clara told her everything. The eyes beneath the paint, the butler's warning, the hidden face, and her mother looked more terrified than she had ever seen her. "Stop it," she cried, grabbing Clara's shoulders. "Do you want to end up like Elise?" Her voice cracked, her hands trembling. Clara pulled away. "What happened to her?" she demanded. Her mother didn't answer. She just whispered. "She found something she shouldn't have, and one morning, she was gone. No one ever found her." Tears filled her eyes as she whispered again, "Promise me, Clara, promise me you'll stay quiet." But Clara couldn't promise that. Not now, not when she felt the truth breathing through the cracks of that cursed house. Hours passed and sleep refused to come. Outside the wind howled through the trees, branches scratching the windows like desperate fingers. Clara sat by the small lamp, staring at the flake of blue paint she had found earlier. She held it between her fingers, watching how it shimmered faintly under the light. and in that moment, she made a decision. She would uncover what was hidden, no matter the risk, because something about this house, about the painting, was calling her, begging her to set it free. The storm grew louder, shaking the shutters, and she thought she heard faint footsteps outside the door again. Slow and careful, like someone listening, she held her breath. The handle moved slightly, and then stopped. She whispered her mother's name. But there was no answer, only the whisper of the wind pushing through the cracks, carrying a faint voice that almost sounded like a woman's cry. Morning came again, grey and cold, and Clara's mother went about her chores in silence, refusing to speak of the night. Clara joined her in cleaning the west wing, where the air felt thicker and the lights always flickered. At the end of the hallway stood a door she had never noticed before, smaller than the others, half hidden behind a tapestry. Curiosity gnawed at her. She reached out, pushing it slightly, and found a narrow staircase leading downward. Her mother saw her and gasped. "Clara." "No," she whispered harshly. "That's the old art storage. It's been locked for years." But the door wasn't locked anymore, and a faint draft carried the scent of turpentine and mold. Clara looked at her mother's pale face, realizing she was genuinely terrified. But before she could speak, Mrs. Beaumont's voice called from upstairs, sharp and demanding, "Maria, Clara, up here, now." They both froze, then hurried to obey. But Clara glanced back at the open door and noticed something. Dust footprints. Not hers, leading up from the darkness below, small, light, and recent. That evening, when the Beaumonts hosted guests, Clara and her mother were told to stay out of sight. She could hear laughter, clinking glasses, and the same man in grey from before speaking in a low voice about the Paris acquisition and the final payment. Her mother stayed quiet, folding linen, pretending not to hear, but Clara couldn't stop listening. One phrase made her blood run cold. The man said, "Once the restoration is finished, no one will ever know the original was destroyed." Mrs. Beaumont laughed lightly, replying, "Destroyed is such a harsh word, darling, I prefer buried." And in that moment Clara understood. This painting wasn't just fake, it was covering up something far worse, maybe even a crime. Her mind filled with flashes of Elise, the missing maid, the hidden face, and her mother's fear. She knew she was standing in the middle of something that could destroy more than reputations, something the walls themselves were trying to warn her about. When the guests left and the house fell silent again, Clara stood by the window watching the car lights fade into the night. Her mother asleep once more, her hands still trembling even in dreams. Clara took out the folded letter, the flake of paint, and the memory of those strange footprints. She placed them all in a small box she kept under her bed, whispering, "Tomorrow, I'll find out what you're hiding," and as if in answer, the wind outside moaned softly through the cracks. The chandelier swayed though there was no breeze, and somewhere deep in the house, the faint echo of a woman's voice in French floated through the darkness, sorrowful and warning, and Clara realized that maybe the truth wasn't just painted over. It was alive, and it was waiting for her to uncover it, no matter the cost. That night the mansion did not sleep. Though the world outside lay wrapped in storm and darkness, the house itself felt alive, humming with tension that crawled through every corridor like a quiet breath. Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of the rain striking the windows like a steady whisper, her mind refusing to rest. The letter's words echoed again and again in her head. The truth of the portrait lies beneath her face. She couldn't forget the eyes hidden under the paint, the faint trace of another woman buried beneath the blue dress. It haunted her every blink, every breath. She turned and saw her mother sleeping beside the flickering candle, her face tired and pale. Even in rest her hands twitched as if scrubbing some invisible stain. Clara sat up, heart pounding. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see what was hidden behind that paint. Whatever was buried under that woman's calm smile needed to be uncovered. She slipped out of bed and pulled her coat tight around her shoulders, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. The house was silent except for the sighing of the wind and the faint drip of water somewhere distant. She took the small candle, shielding its light with her hand as she walked through the hall, her shadow flickering across the walls like a moving ghost. The grand hallway was darker than she remembered, the chandelier above swinging slowly with the draft, its crystals chiming softly like tiny bells of warning. The portrait of the woman in blue loomed at the far end, half lit by the weak flame. The woman's painted eyes seemed to follow her as she approached, and Clara's heart began to race faster, her pulse echoing in her ears. She set the candle on the table beside the wall, its glow spreading across the gold frame. revealing the faint shimmer of paint still wet beneath the varnish. She whispered to herself, "Just a look, that's all." Though she knew it wasn't true. She wasn't here to look, she was here to uncover. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small knife she used for cleaning corners, her hand trembling. She hesitated for only a second before gently scraping the edge of the canvas near the corner. The blade lifted a small curl of blue, and beneath it, she saw another color, crimson red, old and cracked. Her breath caught in her throat. She scraped again, and the candle flickered as if reacting. The air grew thicker, colder. She stepped back for a moment, heart hammering, then leaned forward to look closer. What she saw made her freeze. Beneath the blue was not just another color, but the faint curve of lips. Another mouth hidden under the paint, painted over and erased. She stumbled back, her mind spinning. She whispered, "It's another face." The sound of a door creaking behind her made her turn sharply. The candlelight trembled, throwing shadows across the walls. She held her breath, listening. Then from the darkness came a whisper, faint, a woman's voice speaking French. The same soft tone she had heard before in her dreams. Her skin prickled as the air around her shifted. The flame bent toward the portrait as if drawn to it. And for a moment Clara thought she saw the faint outline of a figure standing behind the glass of a nearby mirror, a reflection that didn't belong to her. She turned but no one was there, just the cold draft sneaking through the cracks of the old mansion. She reached out again and touched the painting, her fingers trembling. It felt warmer than before, almost like skin. She jerked her hand back, her breath shaking, and that's when she heard another sound. Footsteps, heavy ones, steady and slow, coming closer from the side corridor. She blew out the candle instantly, plunging the hallway into darkness. Her back pressed against the wall, her eyes wide. The footsteps stopped near the end of the hall, and the faint beam of a lantern appeared. Swinging slowly, it was the butler again. "Is anyone there?" His voice echoed, calm but dangerous. His lantern's light cut through the darkness like a blade, and Clara stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. She could see the glow reflecting off his spectacles, his eyes scanning the hall. He took a step closer toward the painting, muttering to himself, "She's awake again." Clara frowned in confusion. What did he mean, she's awake again? The butler stopped before the painting, setting the lantern on the table. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable, then sighed deeply and whispered, "You should have stayed buried." He reached out, his gloved hand brushing the canvas in a gesture that almost looked like affection. Then he straightened, grabbed the lantern, and walked away without noticing Clara hiding in the dark corner. His footsteps faded into the distance until only silence remained. Clara exhaled shakily, her entire body trembling. She turned back to the painting, the faint glimmer of red still visible beneath the scraped spot. She wanted to do more, to peel back the layers and see the face beneath. But she knew she couldn't risk being caught again tonight. She covered the tiny mark with dust from her sleeve to hide what she had done and hurried back to her room, her thoughts racing faster than the storm outside. When morning came, the mansion was filled with the smell of polished wood and burning firewood. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary. But Clara felt the unease growing heavier. She went to the kitchen to help her mother prepare breakfast. The cook hummed softly while stirring a pot. The butler moved quietly, not looking at anyone, his expression tired, as if he hadn't slept. Mrs. Beaumont entered the room, cheerful as ever. Though her eyes were sharp and observant, "Clara," she said suddenly. "You were awake late last night, weren't you?" Clara froze, her fingers tightening around the dish she was holding. "No, I went to bed after cleaning," she replied quickly. Mrs. Beaumont smiled faintly. "Strange, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway," she said, her voice casual but her gaze piercing. "This old house plays tricks on the ears," she added after a moment, and turned away, but Clara could feel the tension under her words, as if the woman already knew. Later, as she dusted the grand library, Clara couldn't shake the memory of the butler's whisper. "She's awake again." What did that mean? Who was he talking to, or about? The walls of the mansion seemed to hum faintly, the ticking of the clock too loud, the smell of oil paint stronger than before. She found herself drawn again to the hallway, passing the polished statues and marble columns. When she reached the spot, she froze. The painting was gone, the wall empty, only the faint outline of where it had hung. She looked around in shock, her heart pounding. Mrs. Beaumont appeared from behind her, her voice calm, looking for something. Clara stammered, "The painting, it was here." Mrs. Beaumont smiled slightly. "Oh, that old thing?" It's being restored. My husband thought it was getting dull, she said casually. But her tone carried something else beneath it. A quiet warning. Don't worry, dear. It'll be back soon. Some things just need to be retouched now and then. That evening, Clara's mother seemed distracted and afraid. She avoided Clara's eyes and barely spoke. When Clara pressed her, she just said, "Leave it, child. They know you looked." Clara's chest tightened. What do you mean they know? Her mother shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. Do you think the walls don't talk in this place? They see everything, and they tell her. Clara tried to argue, but her mother turned away, whispering, "Promise me, don't go near that hall again." But Clara couldn't promise. She needed answers, especially now that the painting was gone. Someone had taken it. Maybe to hide what she had uncovered. Maybe to destroy it completely, and she couldn't let that happen. That night, when the house was silent once again, Clara decided to search for it. She crept through the servants' passage, past the dusty storerooms and narrow staircases, her small lamp flickering against the damp walls. In the farthest corner of the basement she found a locked door, newer than the others, the metal shiny, untouched by age. She pressed her ear against it and heard faint shuffling inside, like fabric brushing wood. She whispered softly, "Hello?" No answer came, only silence. Then a single, slow knock echoed from the other side. She jumped back, her lamp nearly slipping from her hand. The sound was too precise to be wind. Someone, or something, was behind that door. She backed away slowly, her breathing quick and shallow, then ran up the stairs, not stopping until she reached the main floor again. She leaned against the wall, trying to calm herself, and that's when she saw something on the floor near the library entrance. A small trail of blue paint drops, leading away from the direction of the basement. She followed them slowly, her heart pounding louder with each step. The trail ended at the base of a large mirror in the hallway, and smeared across the lower edge of the mirror was a single red fingerprint. Small, delicate, like that of a woman. She stared at it for a long moment, fear and curiosity warring inside her. Then she whispered, "Who are you?" But the mirror only reflected her pale face and the empty corridor behind her. She backed away, trembling, and hurried to her room, where she found her mother sitting on the bed, her face white as paper. "Clara," she whispered hoarsely, "what did you do?" Clara blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Her mother clutched a folded letter in her hand, one that hadn't been there before. "This was under our door," she said, handing it to her. Clara unfolded it, the handwriting elegant and familiar. It was Mrs. Beaumont's. The note read, "Curiosity is a dangerous habit, dear. Some things are better left unseen. Keep to your duties, and your mother will remain safe." Clara's blood ran cold. She stared at her mother's frightened face, realizing the threat wasn't hidden anymore. They knew exactly what she had done, and now they were warning her to stop. But it was too late for that. The truth was already in motion, and somewhere deep beneath the layers of blue paint and lies, the woman beneath the portrait was still waiting to be seen, waiting for Clara to finish what she had started, even if it meant tearing down the walls of the Beaumont mansion and the ghosts it kept inside. The morning after the note arrived, the mansion seemed quieter than usual, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was heavy, waiting, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Clara felt it the moment she opened her eyes. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a sky the color of dull silver, and every window in the house was covered in dew that caught no light. Her mother moved around the small room with slow, careful motions, not speaking, her hands shaking as she buttoned her uniform. Clara tried to ask if she was all right, but her mother only muttered, "We'll finish our work and leave tomorrow. I've already written the letter. They can find someone else." Clara wanted to believe her, but something deep in her gut twisted with doubt. It was too late for simple exits. She could feel it. The house had noticed them. When they entered the hall, everything looked as it had before. The polished floors, the tall windows, the faint scent of wax and lilies, yet something was missing. The portrait of the woman in blue was gone, the space it had occupied replaced by an empty rectangle of lighter paint on the wall. Clara stood there staring at that absence for a long time. It was strange how silence could make something feel louder. Mrs. Beaumont appeared behind them suddenly, her voice soft and sweet but her eyes sharp. "Oh, you noticed. We've sent it away for a little restoration. The humidity here does dreadful things to old art." She smiled too much when she said it, and Clara realized that smile never reached her eyes. All through that day, the work felt slower, heavier. The other servants spoke in whispers, glancing toward Clara and her mother as if afraid of being seen talking to them. The butler, always so composed, avoided their eyes completely. Once, while cleaning the east corridor, Clara caught him standing before a locked door with his head bowed, his lips moving as if in silent prayer. When he noticed her, his expression hardened and he said quietly, "The more you look, the more this house sees you back." Then he walked away, leaving her cold and shaken. That night the house changed. It began with the wind. It howled outside the windows like an animal clawing to be let in, and the trees in the garden bent as if bowing to something unseen. The candlelight flickered even though there was no draft inside, and distant doors opened and shut on their own. Clara couldn't sleep. Her mother lay restless beside her, mumbling in her dreams. At midnight, a sound woke Clara fully. A scream, short but sharp, echoing from somewhere deep inside the house. She jumped up, her heart pounding, calling her mother's name. No answer. The bed beside her was empty. The blankets were still warm, but her mother was gone. Clara ran into the hall barefoot, the air cold against her skin. "Mother!" she shouted, her voice bouncing off the marble. There was no reply. The mansion swallowed the sound whole. She grabbed a candle from the table and hurried toward the grand staircase, her trembling hand casting wild shadows along the walls. Somewhere upstairs she heard a faint cry, like someone calling her name, but the voice was muffled, distant, as though it came through thick walls. She turned toward it, moving quickly down the corridor lined with portraits, each face watching her pass with painted judgment. The light trembled. Something about their eyes made her feel like the whole house was awake, aware of her every step. At the end of the corridor, she found the door to the west wing ajar. It was the same hallway where she had seen the footprints before, leading to the narrow staircase that went down to the basement. The smell hit her first, not rot, but something chemical, sharp, almost metallic. Turpentine and something else underneath it, coppery and bitter. Her candlelight touched the walls as she descended, revealing old paintings stacked against the stone, some covered in sheets, some half-burned or torn. The floor was damp, the air thick with mold and age. She called again, her voice shaking, "Mother!" Still no answer. But something else answered, the faint sound of dripping water, then a dragging noise, slow and uneven, somewhere in the darkness ahead. She moved carefully, her heart hammering so loud she could feel it in her throat. The staircase opened into a low stone cellar filled with crates and broken furniture. A single light bulb flickered overhead, swinging slightly. In the corner of the room stood the painting, The Woman in Blue, but now the canvas was torn open across the middle, revealing the ghost of another portrait underneath. The woman's blue dress peeled back like skin, exposing darker colors beneath. A face, half finished, half erased. Clara's breath caught. The paint dripped slowly, still wet, as though someone had been working on it just moments before. She stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking under her weight. That was when she saw it. Her mother's cleaning cloth on the floor beside the painting, streaked with the same blue paint. Panic surged through her. "Mother?" she whispered again, her voice cracking. No one answered, but from somewhere behind the rows of crates came a sound. A faint gasp, then silence. Clara rushed forward, but as she turned the corner she froze. A figure stood in the shadows, not her mother, but Mrs. Beaumont, holding a lantern that glowed like fire against the damp stone. Her face was calm, almost kind, but her eyes gleamed with something cold and triumphant. "You shouldn't be here, Clara," she said softly. "This part of the house is not for servants." Clara's voice trembled. "Where is my mother?" Mrs. Beaumont tilted her head. "Your mother was very loyal. She kept our secrets for many years. But sometimes loyalty fades. Sometimes, curiosity becomes a disease." She stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the wall like a dark wing. Clara backed away until she hit the corner of the crate. "What did you do to her?" she whispered. Mrs. Beaumont smiled faintly, her teeth catching the lantern light. "Don't look at me like that. I didn't hurt her." She simply went where the truth sleeps. And you, my dear, are standing very close to joining her. Before Clara could move, the butler appeared behind Mrs. Beaumont, his face pale, his eyes wide with something like fear. "Madam," he said quickly, "the girl knows too much. Let me handle it." Mrs. Beaumont turned to him, her expression hardening. "No. She'll see for herself what happens to the ones who dig too deep." Then she turned back to Clara. "Do you want to know what's beneath that painting so badly? Go on, look." Her tone was mocking, daring. Clara's breath came in gasps, but she forced herself forward, staring at the torn canvas. Underneath the woman's blue dress, another portrait was emerging, a different face, one she recognized instantly. It was her mother. Younger, smiling faintly, her eyes filled with life. The realization hit her like a blow. Her mother had been the original subject of the painting. Tears filled her eyes as she turned toward Mrs. Beaumont. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Mrs. Beaumont's expression didn't change. "Because she belonged to someone who made a mistake. The artist fell in love with her, a servant, and dared to paint her. That portrait was meant to hang here long ago, but my family couldn't allow it. So we covered her, erased her, turned her into someone worthy of the Beaumont name. And when she came back years later, we made sure she remembered her place." Her tone was cold, distant, as though she were reciting history, not confessing a sin. Clara felt her chest tighten, fury and grief twisting together. "You painted over her like she was nothing," she said through clenched teeth. Mrs. Beaumont laughed softly. "No, dear. We turned her into something better. Isn't that what art is? Taking the ugly truth and making it beautiful." She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the torn canvas, leaving a faint red smear. Paint or blood, Clara couldn't tell. The butler shifted uneasily. "Madam, this isn't wise," he said quietly, but she ignored him. "Go fetch the rest," she ordered, and he hesitated before walking away into the shadows. Clara seized the chance. She grabbed a wooden plank from the ground and swung it, shattering the lantern in Mrs. Beaumont's hand. The cellar plunged into darkness, the smell of burning oil filling the air. She ran toward the stairs, stumbling, hearing Mrs. Beaumont shouting behind her, "You'll regret this, girl." Clara didn't stop. She climbed the steps 2 at a time, her legs shaking, her heart a drumbeat in her ears. She burst into the hallway and slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands. The corridor was empty, silent, but the air felt thicker, heavier, almost alive. She ran toward her room, calling for her mother again and again, but no voice answered. The bed was empty, her things untouched. On the small table beside the window lay a folded piece of paper. She snatched it up and unfolded it, her hands shaking. The handwriting was her mother's this time. It said only 4 words, "Don't let them win." Clara sank to the floor, her heart breaking, realizing that her mother might already be gone, swallowed by the same darkness that had consumed the artist, the maid named Elise, and whoever else the Beaumonts had erased. She looked out the window at the garden below, the garden with the strange mounds of earth near the roses, the same garden where she had once seen the man in grey bury something on her first night. The truth wasn't just under paint. It was buried in the soil too. And now, with nothing left to lose, she swore she would dig it up, even if it meant tearing the Beaumont's empire apart stone by stone. The storm began again outside, lightning flashing against the walls of the mansion, and Clara whispered into the thunder, "I'll find you, Mother. I promise." The house creaked in answer, like it was laughing at her promise, but this time Clara didn't flinch. The fear that once held her was gone. Only determination remained. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, the wind carried the faintest echo of a woman's voice, soft but steady, whispering her name. The night stretched endlessly after that, a slow, suffocating darkness that pressed down on Clara until she could no longer tell whether her shaking came from fear or cold. The candlelight trembled as she sat beside the window clutching her mother's note, her fingers tracing the words again and again, "Don't let them win." The message felt heavier than the paper itself, like it carried every whisper, every scream that had ever been buried within the walls of the Beaumont mansion. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the world still felt wet, heavy with mist and silence. The trees swayed without wind, the garden below looked like a black sea of moving shadows, and she thought for a moment she saw someone standing between the rose bushes, a pale shape that vanished when she blinked. Clara told herself it was the fog. She told herself many things that night, but none of them eased the weight inside her chest. She knew one truth only. The Beaumonts had her mother, and they had done this before. When dawn crept into the house, grey and thin, Clara didn't sleep. Her mother's bed remained empty, her uniform folded neatly as if she had left for work and never returned. The rest of the staff moved around the house quietly, avoiding her eyes. Some wouldn't even speak when she passed. The cook muttered prayers under her breath. The gardener left the back doors bolted though the morning sun was out. Everyone knew something, yet no one dared to speak. Clara walked through the hallway, her reflection flickering in the tall mirrors, and for the first time she noticed the cracks in the mansion's perfection. Small ones, but everywhere. A faint stain of water on the ceiling, the edge of a painting frame slightly warped, the sound of the wind slipping through the walls as if the house was exhaling. By afternoon, Mrs. Beaumont summoned her. The message came through the butler, his face unreadable. "The mistress wants a word," he said simply. Clara followed him through the corridor, her palms sweating. The door to the study opened, and Mrs. Beaumont sat behind her desk, dressed in pale silk, her hair perfectly arranged, her lips the same red as the paint that had bled from the portrait. The torn painting now hung behind her, patched crudely, the woman in blue restored, but the eyes were wrong, almost too bright, and Clara felt her stomach twist. "You've been busy," Mrs. Beaumont said softly. Her tone wasn't angry. It was worse. Calm. Confident. Running through the halls, asking questions, touching things that don't belong to you. That's not very polite for a maid's daughter. Clara stood still, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Where is my mother?" she asked. Mrs. Beaumont leaned back in her chair, tapping one red nail against the desk. "Your mother made choices, dear. Choices have consequences. You'd do well to remember that." Clara clenched her fists. "If you hurt her, oh, child," Mrs. Beaumont interrupted, smiling faintly, "we didn't hurt her. We honored her. She's part of this house now, just as the others are." She gestured toward the walls, and for a heartbeat Clara thought she saw movement in the oil portraits, the faint shimmer of eyes blinking behind layers of paint. Mrs. Beaumont continued, "Your mother was very loyal. She knew things, old things, secrets that should have stayed buried. But she couldn't stop digging. Just like you." Clara's voice came out shaking, filled with anger. "You killed her." Mrs. Beaumont's smile froze. For a moment her mask slipped, and Clara saw the sharp truth beneath. "Death is such a small word," she said coldly. "Sometimes people simply change form. They become what they were always meant to be." She stood, her figure tall and elegant against the light from the window. "You see, this house isn't just a home. It's a legacy. Every brick, every painting, every servant who's ever walked its halls, they all belong to it. To us." She moved closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "And soon, so will you." The butler stepped forward, reaching for Clara's arm, but she jerked away. "Don't touch me," she snapped. Her voice echoed across the room. For a second, even Mrs. Beaumont looked startled by the strength in it. Clara backed toward the door, her pulse wild. "I'll find her," she said through clenched teeth. "I'll find her and I'll show everyone what you did." Mrs. Beaumont tilted her head, pitying. "You won't find what's already part of the walls," she said softly. Then she nodded to the butler. "Escort her to her room. Make sure she stays there." Clara was locked in her quarters until nightfall. The window was barred, and a guard stood in the hall. The moment she was alone, she began to plan. If her mother had become part of the house, there was only one place that could mean. The cellar where the portraits were stored, the place Mrs. Beaumont had called where the truth sleeps. Clara waited until the sound of footsteps faded, then pried open the small vent near the floor and crawled through the narrow passageway. Dust filled her lungs, but she kept going, her heart hammering in her ears. She emerged into the dark laundry room, where moonlight crept through a small window. The air was thick with the smell of soap and damp cloth. She moved silently through the servants' corridor, her bare feet making no sound. The door to the basement was closed, but the lock was old. She used a hairpin, her hands shaking, and after several tries, it clicked open. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, smelling of old paint and something far worse: earth, rot, and grief. She stepped down slowly, the wooden stairs creaking under her weight. The deeper she went, the colder it became. The flicker of her small lantern cast moving shadows across the walls, and she realized the paintings stored there weren't just broken art. Many of them had faces, faces she recognized. Elise, the maid from her mother's story, staring out from under layers of paint, her eyes pleading silently. Others she didn't know, servants, men, women, all covered by the same blue-tinted varnish. Clara's breath came in shallow bursts as she moved deeper. At the far end of the room stood something covered by a large white sheet. She approached it slowly, her trembling hand reaching to lift the cloth. Underneath was a painting still wet, the scent of turpentine thick and burning in her nose. The figure on the canvas was unfinished, but she didn't need to guess. She saw her mother's face, still forming under the brushstrokes. Eyes painted open, skin pale, mouth curved in a faint, unnatural smile. The horror hit her so hard she dropped the lantern. The flame sputtered on the damp floor, throwing wild light across the walls. Her knees went weak. She whispered, "No, no, this isn't real." But it was. The texture of the paint, the precision of the features, it was her mother, trapped forever on that cursed canvas. A noise came from behind her. The sound of someone descending the stairs. Clara spun around, her eyes wide, and saw the butler emerge from the shadows, his expression grim. "I told you not to look," he said quietly. His voice was almost kind, almost regretful. She tried to leave. They all try. The house doesn't let them. Clara shook her head in disbelief, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You helped them," she whispered. "You did this." The butler sighed. "I tried to protect you," he said softly. "You're not the first daughter to come looking for her mother. But none of them ever make it out." He stepped closer, and Clara's fear turned to fury. She grabbed a broken frame from the ground and swung it, striking him across the shoulder. He stumbled back, groaning, and she ran past him toward the stairs. He shouted after her, but she didn't look back. She reached the top and burst through the door into the hallway, gasping for air. The whole house seemed alive now, the lights flickering, the walls groaning as if waking from a long sleep. Clara raced through the corridors, clutching her mother's note against her chest. She had to escape, had to tell someone. But when she reached the front doors, they wouldn't open. The lock turned freely, but the doors wouldn't budge, as though held shut by something stronger than wood or metal. A voice came from behind her, Mrs. Beaumont's voice, calm and measured. "Leaving so soon, dear?" Clara turned slowly. Mrs. Beaumont stood at the top of the grand staircase, her gown flowing like shadow. "You see now, don't you? The house chooses who stays. It always has." She descended the stairs slowly, her eyes glowing in the dim light. "Your mother is safe here. You could be, too. Just stop fighting." Clara backed away, shaking her head. "You're monsters," she said through clenched teeth. Mrs. Beaumont smiled faintly. "No, child. We're preservers. The world forgets beauty. We make sure it endures." She reached out a hand, as though offering comfort, but Clara turned and ran, darting into the side corridor that led to the west wing. She could hear Mrs. Beaumont's voice echoing after her, no longer calm but sharp, furious. "You can't hide from this house." Clara ran without direction until she found herself in the old art room again, the one where her mother's painting had first been discovered. The air was cold and heavy, the smell of oil strong enough to sting her eyes. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, panting, tears streaming down her face. Her gaze fell on the torn scraps of old canvas scattered on the floor, and an idea took root in her mind. She grabbed one of the pieces, dipped it into the bucket of turpentine, and threw it against the nearest candle flame. The fabric caught fire instantly, the blaze bright and furious. Clara backed away as the flames spread across the old wooden shelves. "You wanted your art to live forever," she whispered, her voice trembling, "then let it burn." The fire roared to life, devouring the paintings one by one. The house seemed to scream with it, the walls groaning, the air pulsing with heat and fury. Somewhere above, she heard Mrs. Beaumont shouting orders, the butler's voice calling her name, but Clara didn't stop. She turned toward the stairwell, clutching her mother's note in her fist. The smoke thickened, the air turning to ash, but she forced herself forward. The mansion's grand staircase cracked as flames crawled up its sides. She stumbled through the smoke, coughing, her lungs burning, until she reached the front hall again. The doors that once refused to open now groaned under the heat. She slammed her shoulder into them again and again until they burst wide. Cold air hit her face like salvation. She fell to her knees outside, gasping, the night rain returning in a soft drizzle that hissed against the flames. Behind her, the Beaumont mansion burned like a dying god, the windows glowing red, the roof collapsing in on itself. And just before the final crash of the timbers, Clara thought she saw, through the fire and smoke, the faint outline of her mother's face in one of the upstairs windows, smiling, peaceful, free at last. Clara wept. She stayed there until the dawn came, the fire reduced to smoke and ruin. The authorities would arrive later, and they would ask questions she could never answer. But none of that mattered now. She had kept her promise. She hadn't let them win. And as the first light of morning touched the ashes of the mansion, she whispered to the wind, "You're free, Mama," and walked away, leaving behind a house that would never whisper again. The smoke from the Beaumont mansion still hung over the valley the next morning, thick and grey like an old ghost that refused to leave. Clara sat on the edge of the gravel road, her dress torn, her skin smeared with ash, her eyes hollow but alive. The ruins of the mansion smoldered behind her, blackened walls reaching like broken fingers toward the sky, the great windows shattered, the once golden doors melted into twisted iron. The air smelled of wet soot and paint, the earth scorched where the garden had been. She had stayed there all night, half-conscious, listening to the fire die down, watching the house that had swallowed her mother burn to dust. When the sun finally rose, the world looked grey and strange, as if it too couldn't believe the Beaumont legacy was gone. The first people to arrive were the townsfolk, curious, cautious, whispering among themselves. They stood in clusters along the road, clutching coats against the cold morning air. No one dared step too close at first. Everyone in town knew the Beaumonts. They owned land, art, and half the people's debts. The mansion burning was like watching a mountain collapse, unthinkable. A policeman finally approached Clara, a tall man with kind eyes and a notebook in hand. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked gently. Clara nodded, though her voice came out hoarse when she said, "It's over." He looked at her, then at the ruins, uncertain how to begin. "Were you in the house when it caught fire?" he asked. She hesitated. The truth was heavier than smoke. "I was," she whispered. "My mother, she worked there. She's gone." More officers came. Questions followed. How? When? Why? Clara answered what she could, though most of her words were swallowed by grief. They asked about Mrs. Beaumont, her husband, the servants. No one had been found yet. The fire had moved too fast, too deep. Only the butler's body was discovered near the cellar door, burned beyond recognition but still clutching a ring that bore the family's crest. As for Mrs. Beaumont, no trace. Not a body, not even a scrap of silk. Some said she must have escaped. Others said she had gone down with the house. Clara said nothing. Later, as the firemen dug through the remains, Clara wandered toward the garden, the one where her mother used to sweep the leaves in silence. The roses were gone now, replaced by black soil and ash, but the faint outlines of the flower beds remained. She knelt there, pressing her fingers into the earth. It was still warm. And then she saw it, a small piece of something white sticking out from the soil near the base of the old fountain. She brushed away the dirt and froze. It was a shard of porcelain, part of a teacup. But beneath it, as she cleared more soil, her fingers struck wood. A box. She dug with her bare hands until she could pull it free. The box was scorched on the outside but intact. Its brass lock had melted away, so she pried it open with a rock. Inside, wrapped in damp linen, were old papers, letters, sketches, and several small photographs. Clara held them close as she sat there in the ruins. The first photo was faded, but she recognized her mother instantly, young, standing beside another woman with striking eyes. On the back was a name written in delicate script. Elise Beaumont, 1902. Elise. The same name her mother had whispered in fear, the maid who had asked too many questions. Clara turned to the letters next, written in French. Though she couldn't understand all of them, she recognized certain words: forgery, scandal, disappearance. Each letter was signed with the same initials, LM. Her heart pounded. That was the same mark hidden beneath the paint of the portrait. The same hand that had painted the woman in blue. LM wasn't just an artist. They were part of the family's secret. She took the papers to the police station that afternoon. The officers translated them with the help of an old archivist from town. The truth unfolded like a slow nightmare. Decades ago, the Beaumonts had hired a painter named Lucien Moreau, a French artist known for his realism. He had come to paint portraits of the family, but he fell in love with one of the maids, Elise. When Mrs. Beaumont's ancestor discovered the affair, she ordered the artist to paint her instead, over the same canvas, covering Elise's face with her own. When Lucien refused, he vanished. The portrait remained, and the family passed it down for generations, pretending it was pure art, not a grave of love and guilt. Clara's mother had known the story. She had been Elise's great-granddaughter, returning to the same house decades later, unknowingly serving the same bloodline that erased her family. When the police finished reading, silence filled the room. The inspector looked at Clara with something like pity and disbelief. This is murder and fraud spanning generations, he said quietly. If the Beaumont woman is alive, she'll answer for this. But even as he spoke, Clara knew Mrs. Beaumont was gone. The fire had taken her, or perhaps the house itself had. Some curses burned too deep to survive. Weeks passed. The ruins of the mansion were cleared away, brick by brick, revealing more than anyone expected. Beneath the garden they found several shallow graves. The bodies were too old to name, but among them were pieces of jewelry, servant uniforms, and paintbrushes sealed in jars of oil. The newspapers called it the Beaumont mystery, a story of wealth, lies, and murder. Reporters flooded the town, flashing cameras and shouting questions. They called Clara the girl who escaped the haunted mansion, though she hated the word haunted. The house hadn't been haunted, it had simply remembered. One evening, after the attention died down, Clara returned alone to what was left of the estate. The fire had destroyed everything, but the air still carried the faint smell of oil paint, like memory clinging to ash. She walked through the blackened foundations until she reached the spot where her mother's painting had once hung. The wind stirred the soot into small spirals. She knelt and laid the photo of her mother and Elise on the ground. "You're free now," she whispered. "They can't hide you anymore." For a long time, she stayed there, letting the silence of the earth answer her. But as she stood to leave, she saw something that stopped her cold. Beneath a fallen beam near the cellar steps, a piece of charred canvas clung stubbornly to the wood. She crouched down and carefully peeled it free. It was small, burned around the edges, but the image on it was clear. A pair of eyes, painted in shades of brown and gray, unmistakably alive even through the smoke stains. They were her mother's eyes. And yet, for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw them move. She carried the fragment with her, wrapping it in cloth. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the small fire in the cottage where she now lived, staring at the piece of painting. The flame's light danced over the surface, making the eyes shimmer faintly, almost glistening. It could have been a trick of light, but when the wind blew through the cracks in the door, she heard something soft, like a sigh, or a whisper, in French. She leaned closer, her heart racing, listening. The voice was faint, fading in and out like smoke. It sounded like her mother's voice, saying her name, and then the same words she had written in the note. Don't let them win. The next day, Clara took the letters and the canvas fragment to a small museum in the city. The curator, a kind woman with round glasses, listened as Clara told her everything. The painting, the fire, the graves, the truth. When she finished, the curator's eyes were wet. These should be preserved, she said gently. Your mother's story deserves to be told. They displayed the fragment and the letters in a glass case titled The Hidden Faces of Beaumont Hall. Visitors came, reading the story, whispering in shock. Some called it tragedy. Some called it justice. Clara called it freedom. Yet even as life slowly moved forward, the mansion's shadow never left her. At night, she sometimes dreamed of corridors filled with paintings, each one whispering faintly as she passed. Sometimes, in the silence before dawn, she swore she could smell turpentine and roses again. But instead of fear, she felt peace. The house was gone, and the souls it had trapped were no longer bound. The curse had ended with her. One evening, months later, Clara visited the museum again. She stood before the glass case, staring at her mother's painted eyes. The curator approached quietly and said, "People still talk about you. The girl who burned the lies." Clara smiled faintly. "I didn't burn lies," she whispered. "I burned the truth they were too afraid to face." The curator nodded, then left her alone. Clara reached out, her reflection merging with the image inside the glass. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw the eyes blink again, slow and gentle, as if saying goodbye. And in that moment, for the first time since the fire, Clara felt something warm on her cheek. Not tears, but sunlight, soft and golden, filtering through the museum's windows. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and whispered, "Rest now, Mama." Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain and paint, and the world moved on. But somewhere, deep in the ashes of the past, a quiet peace finally bloomed where the lies of the Beaumonts had once stood. The seasons turned, and time carried the ashes of Beaumont Mansion into silence, but silence did not mean peace. The town changed after the fire, new houses rose, the road widened, and the whispers faded into stories told over dinner tables and in quiet bars. To most people, the Beaumonts became ghosts of history, a scandal sealed in old newspapers, a story mothers warned their children about. But for Clara, it never truly ended. Even after months had passed, she still woke at night hearing the soft crackle of burning wood, the echo of her mother's voice whispering, "Don't let them win." The past lingered in her dreams, painting itself behind her eyelids in strokes of blue and gray. Every sound reminded her of that house. The creak of her cottage door, the brush of wind against glass, even the scent of rain on stone. She could never forget. After the museum displayed the letters and the fragment of the painting, everything changed. Reporters called, artists wrote about her, and strangers thanked her for revealing the truth. But Clara didn't feel like a hero. She felt hollow, like someone who had opened a door that could never close again. She had exposed what the Beaumonts did, how they built their fortune on stolen art, stolen love, and stolen lives. But she had also lost everything she loved in the process. Some nights she would sit by her window with a candle burning low, staring at the flickering flame and imagining her mother sitting across from her, humming softly as she used to. She would whisper into the quiet, "I did it, Mama. It's over," but the room always stayed silent, except for the sighing wind. One morning, a letter arrived at her small cottage. The envelope was thick, sealed with red wax bearing a crest she didn't recognize. Inside was a typed letter in formal English. "Miss Clara Marin, we are writing to inform you that certain items recovered from the Beaumont estate have been returned to your possession, as rightful heir of the late Maria Marin." Her heart stopped when she read her mother's name. The note continued, explaining that among the recovered belongings were several paintings, all unsigned, but matching the style of the artist Lucien Moreau, the man whose love had been buried under generations of lies. The museum had arranged for them to be stored in a private gallery until she claimed them. The next day, Clara traveled to the city. The gallery was quiet, filled with the smell of varnish and dust. The curator greeted her kindly and led her to a back room. "We found these in the lower vault of the mansion," she explained. "They were protected by metal cases. Somehow they survived the fire." Clara followed her through the narrow aisle until they stopped before 3 covered frames. The curator pulled the cloth away gently, revealing paintings that made Clara's heart ache. They were portraits, not of nobility, not of lords or ladies, but of ordinary people. Servants, workers, and one woman who looked just like her mother, standing in the garden, sunlight falling over her face. The colors were soft, real, alive. Clara reached out, her fingertips trembling just above the paint. "He painted them all," she whispered. The curator nodded. "Yes. It seems Lucien Moreau immortalized those who served, not those who ruled. That was his rebellion." Clara's eyes filled with tears. In every brushstroke she saw defiance, love, and remembrance. Her mother had been right to keep searching. The truth was more than a scandal. It was a legacy reclaimed from ashes. The museum offered to buy the paintings, but Clara refused. She wanted them to stay together, protected, not owned. She used the small inheritance her mother left her and purchased a small cottage outside town, turning it into a modest gallery. She called it the Hidden Garden, named after the one her mother had once tended beneath the Beaumont's windows. People came from far away to see it. They didn't just look at the paintings. They listened to the silence between them, the way the colors seemed to breathe. Every visitor left with the same expression, or mixed with sorrow. Over the years, Clara became known not as the girl who burned the mansion but as the keeper of forgotten faces. Students came to learn her story, journalists wrote books, and still, she lived simply, her hands always dusted with the smell of oil and wood polish. Yet some nights, when the world was quiet, she would still wake with her heart pounding, hearing footsteps in her dreams. The echo of heels against marble floors, the whisper of silk dresses in dark halls. And always, she would see her mother's face at the edge of the firelight, watching her. One evening, years later, as Clara closed the small gallery after the last visitors left, she noticed something odd. The light outside was fading, and the air carried the faint scent of rain. She walked to the largest painting, the one of her mother standing in the garden. It had always been her favorite, not just because it was beautiful, but because it felt alive. Tonight, though, something was different. The light from the lamp flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw the faintest movement. The corner of her mother's painted mouth softening into a smile. Clara froze, staring. The air grew still, heavy, as if time itself was holding its breath. Then came a whisper, soft, almost like the rustle of leaves. "You kept your promise." Tears filled Clara's eyes. She stepped closer, resting her palm gently against the lower frame. "I never stopped, Mama," she whispered back. "They'll remember you now. They'll remember all of you." A breeze passed through the open window, though the night outside was still, and it carried with it the faintest hint of roses, the same kind that once grew in the Beaumont garden. The candles flickered again, but instead of fear, Clara felt calm. Warm. The next morning, when the gallery opened, visitors found a small note pinned beside the painting. In Clara's neat handwriting, it read, "This portrait is more than art. It is proof that truth can burn, but it can never die." Beneath it, a small frame held a photograph of her mother, smiling the same gentle smile that now lived forever in color and light. Years later, when Clara was old and her hair had turned silver, she still visited the gallery every morning. Children would greet her as she passed, calling her Miss Clara of the Hidden Garden. She would smile, sit by the window, and tell stories about the mansion, about love and lies, about art and freedom. And though her voice grew softer with age, her eyes never lost their fire. When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep, the townspeople held a small vigil outside the gallery. The paintings were left untouched, their colors glowing faintly in the candlelight. Some swore that as the final candle burned low, the woman in the garden portrait turned her head slightly toward the window, her smile widening, as if welcoming someone home. And in that quiet moment, beneath the golden dawn, The wind carried a single whisper through the gallery halls. A soft, eternal voice saying, "We won, Clara."